Nitric oxide is an interesting molecule. It's very simple and it's a free radical, meaning that it has an unpaired electron in the outer orbital. But nitric oxide is a good free radical in that it likes to donate its electron in its outer orbital rather than scavenge other electrons. When nitric oxide was first discovered, it was thought to be just another vasodilator. We now know that nitric oxide really controls vascularity and perfusion through all blood vessels. It really goes beyond cardiology and cardiovascular medicine because we know that well-vascularized tissues are more resistant to infections and capable of localizing and containing offending agents. In contrast, poorly vascularized tissues are relatively inefficient in responding to the inflammatory stimuli. We know that every single human disease has a vascular component. Whether it is a dysfunctional heart or liver, dementia, other neurological disorders, the common denominator is hypoperfusion or poor blood flow. So, in order for us to combat these age-related chronic diseases that plague Americans and really people worldwide, we have to fix the vascular problem. We now have the technology to not only diagnose nitric oxide deficiency, but actually restore the production of nitric oxide. This is a very important paper published several years ago that really shows the importance of nitric oxide outside of simple vasodilation. It shows that nitric oxide is a signaling molecule and that you need nitric oxide bound to hemoglobin in order to offload oxygen from the red cell. Without nitric oxide-based signaling, the R to T transition, this allosteric delivery of oxygen, does not occur. You need nitric oxide bound. So the cardiorespiratory cycle is really a three-gas system. It's oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitric oxide. You need nitric oxide for the system to work. With over 160,000 published papers in the scientific literature, nitric oxide plays a role in every biological function, from maintaining the integrity of the cardiovascular system to being the non-noradrenergic, non-cholinergic mediator in the periphery. It's the requisite signal for stem cell mobilization and differentiation. It's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, controls cell cycle, it dilates bronchial airways, and it's the main molecule responsible for erections in both men and women. So again, it's all about blood flow. In 1998, the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was awarded to these three U.S. scientists for their discovery of nitric oxide as a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. In 1977, Fred Murad discovered that nitric oxide is generated from drugs like nitroglycerin. So prior to the 1970s, drugs like nitroglycerin or organic nitrates were used for the treatment of acute angina for 150 years. But it wasn't known how they worked. They just realized they worked. It was Dr. Murad that discovered that they worked because they metabolize in the nitric oxide. They dilate the coronary arteries and you get complete symptomatic relief at the ischemic pain known as angina. In 1980, Bob Furchtgott discovered that our endothelial cells produce a substance that causes these blood vessels to relax, and he termed this endothelium-derived relaxing factor, or EDRF. And then 7 years later, Louis Ignarro discovered that EDRF is nitric oxide. So the pieces of the puzzle were put together that if you give an exogenous nitric oxide donor or stimulate endogenous nitric oxide production, it leads to increased perfusion, increased blood flow. And when you increase blood flow, everything works better. So clinically, you may ask yourself, who needs nitric oxide, or who may be a candidate for nitric oxide? Certainly, anybody that's aging, anybody over the age of 40, any patient with circulatory issues, diabetics, people with low energy, and people with sexual dysfunction. Antacids play a big role in inhibiting endogenous nitric oxide production, so anyone on antacids. And most importantly, anybody interested in heart disease prevention. It's much cheaper and easier to prevent disease than it is to treat disease. Anyone diagnosed with vascular dysfunction is, by definition, nitric oxide deficient. And we simplify this to vascular biology with a quote from the 1600s. A man is as old as his arteries. We know through years of research that as we age, plaque starts depositing in the lining of the blood vessels. Over time, this plaque becomes unstable. It ruptures, and when there's ruptured plaque in the coronary arteries, that's a heart attack. When it's in the cerebral arteries, it's a stroke. And that is the number one killer of men and women worldwide. We also know and develop peripheral blood biomarkers that are diagnostic for the degree of cardiovascular disease. So if you have a heart attack and you go to the ER, they'll pull blood, and if you have an increase in troponin T, that's diagnostic for acute MI. At that point, it's really too late, but there are biomarkers that show up when you have a vulnerable plaque or vascular inflammation, such as certain lipoprotein particles or myeloperoxidase. But in these earlier stages of microvascular dysfunction and inflammation, you start to see C-reactive protein, this inflammatory biomarker, or microalbum in the urea. So we can begin to look at peripheral blood biomarkers that accurately reflect the degree of vascular disease. So how does nitric oxide play a role in this? The functional loss of nitric oxide production precedes these structural changes that occurred later in disease by many years, sometimes decades. So it's very important, even in asymptomatic patients, to understand what their capacity to generate nitric oxide is. Because if they've lost the ability to make nitric oxide, they are on a very slippery slope to full-blown cardiovascular disease, heart attack, and stroke. And so that begs the question, how do you control and regulate nitric oxide production? Well, by first understanding how the body makes nitric oxide. You can then start to understand in individual patients what goes wrong in patients that can't make it. Then, and only then, can you fix these production pathways. There are really two ways the body makes nitric oxide. The first one is through a pathway using an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. This converts arginine to nitric oxide. The other, more recently discovered pathway was using inorganic nitrate from the diet, primarily green leafy vegetables or beetroot, that is converted to nitrate and nitric oxide. Each pathway provides about 50% of the total body nitric oxide production. One can compensate for the other, but when you lose the function of NOS and when you disrupt this pathway, here you get complete nitric oxide deficiency. And that's when bad things begin to happen. This is a simplified enzymology and biochemistry of the NOS pathway because for years people thought we'll just give L-Arginine and make nitric oxide. Well, that's a very naive assumption because there's a lot of biochemistry that has to occur. So this NOS enzyme has to be coupled with these 8 different cofactors and substrates in order to convert this guanidino nitrogen through a 5-electron multi-step oxidation to nitric oxide. So this is a very energetically and kinetically unfavorable reaction. But in young, healthy people, this enzyme works, converts arginine to nitric oxide. But if this enzyme is uncoupled, and you see that of patients with endothelial dysfunction, then you give arginine and you generate superoxide instead of nitric oxide. So you can actually make these patients worse. This is what we're all faced with in looking at the endothelial nitric oxide production pathway. So this is the NOS-dependent pathway. The older we get, the less nitric oxide we make in the endothelium. By the time we're 50 years old or 40 years old, we only have about 50% of the nitric oxide we had when we were younger. And 50% of the men over the age of 40 report some degree of erectile dysfunction. So that tells us that when you lose the ability to make nitric oxide, you lose the regulation of blood flow, and that's when you start to see the symptoms. And obviously, 40-year-olds don't perform as well as they did when they were in their 20s, whether it's in the boardroom, the bedroom, or on the athletic field. And this should give you an appreciation for how this works. This would be the lumen of the blood vessel. This is the single layer of endothelial cells that line all blood vessels throughout the body. But in a normal, healthy individual, when we begin to exercise, this causes shear stress and turns this enzyme on. It converts arginine to nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas, so it diffuses into the lumen of the blood vessel, where it interacts with platelets, monocytes, and neutrophils, but part of it diffuses into the smooth muscle where it activates an enzyme called guanyl cyclase. This is the enzyme that Dr. Murad worked on and elucidated. This enzyme converted GTP into cyclic GMP, and that's responsible for the calcium-dependent relaxation. But in men with erectile dysfunction, they are given drugs like Viagra or PDE5 inhibitors, and these work downstream of nitric oxide. So they prevent the breakdown of cyclic GMP. But 45% of the men that are prescribed by Viagra do not respond with better erectile function, and the reason for that is because they don't make enough nitric oxide here to lead to any accumulation of cyclic GMP. So this told us that erectile dysfunction in both men and women is really the first sign and symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. This is the canary in the coal mine, because if you have dysfunction in insufficient nitric oxide production in the blood vessels that perfuse the genitalia or the sex organs, you have nitric oxide deficiency in the coronary arteries, the cerebral arteries, and really any arteries throughout the body. So you have true endothelial dysfunction. This is a paper published in Nature Medicine in 2011 showing the partial urea cycle enzymes. This tells us that the NOS enzyme uses intracellular arginine that comes from citrulline. So it doesn't use extracellular L-Arginine, but it uses arginine that comes from citrulline, that then goes to make nitric oxide to get citrulline as a byproduct. And through the prostrate urea cycle makes arginine the arginine shuttle through nitric oxide. So you have this really nice intramolecular shuttling to make nitric oxide. This is important because the ability to generate nitric oxide predicts exercise capacity. So the more nitric oxide you can make in the lining of the blood vessel, the better athlete you are and the better you can perform. And to the contrary, these are older patients undergoing an exercise stress test that have hidden female dysfunction in the coronary arteries. And when you put them on a treadmill and increase their workload, their coronary arteries can't make nitric oxide. They fail the stress test and they're typically wheeled up to the cardiac cath lab with stents or cracked open for bypass surgery. So, your ability to generate nitric oxide in every vascular bed in the body is probably the most important vascular response in mammalian physiology. So just to summarize, arginine utilization is controlled by the function of nitric oxide synthase enzyme, not by arginine deficiency. Dietary nitrate utilization is controlled by the amount of nitrate consumed in the diet and the presence of oral nitrate-reducing bacteria. What about nitrate-based technologies? There are a number of beetroot products on the market, and they must contain nitrate. Effectiveness of these are determined by factors such as growth conditions and time of harvest. Liquid products don't work. Patients need nitrate-reducing bacteria. And finally, patients consuming proton pump inhibitor or antiseptic mouthwash will not respond to nitrate-based products. So what is the effect of nitric oxide in cardiovascular disease? The literature tells us that loss of nitric oxide production is one of the first events in the onset and progression of disease, and in fact, it's really considered the holy grail of cardiovascular medicine. To conclude, we have provided you with some fundamental education and awareness that nitric oxide controls and regulates vascular structure and function. We discussed the age-related decline in nitric oxide production that asserts its effect on cardiovascular risk. Restoring nitric oxide production, and only by restoring nitric oxide production can you lead to better vascular function and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, the #1 killer of men and women worldwide. Strategies to restore nitric oxide production will have a profound impact on public health in the aging process, and any anti-aging strategy should include nitric oxide as a first line of defense, because your patients cannot and will not get better unless you fix the nitric oxide production pathway. Learning about nitric oxide as a clinician and educating patients is vital in reducing cardiovascular disease for humanity. This is truly one of the best examples of what you don't know can kill you. If you'd like more information about nitric oxide and solutions for patients, visit neo40pro.com. That's NEO40pro.com.